Moving from geography to archaeology to history. We're kind of doing a chronological timeline here, which is something that is dear to my historian's heart, keeping it all in order. And our next speaker is Elizabeth Ellis, and I'm going to sound like the proud parent here because I've known Liz since she was a fall freshman here at Tulane, where she did her undergraduate. And for the many students that we have in the audience, this is my shout out to you that you too can have that one kind of course that changes your direction or changes what you will end up doing or researching in your life. Liz impressed me so much in her fall freshman year that I asked her the very next semester to do an independent study with me. And that independent study was working on 18th century documents, documenting historic tribes here in southern Louisiana. She then went on to work with me as a service learning fellow in other capacities with the Pontchartrain Indian tribe. She did her master's and her PhD at UNC, so we have another UNC doctorate here in the audience. And when she graduated with her PhD, she was awarded the Barra Postdoctoral Fellow at the McNeil Center for Early American Studies, and in conjunction with that was the visiting assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania. She is currently the assistant professor of Native American and Early American History at New York City. And so I'm very happy to have her here because yesterday a northeaster was striking the whole East Coast and she made it out after spending many hours on the tarmac. I also want to take this opportunity, and we're going to talk about this more in the 4 o'clock hour, but to speak about people who are researching documents today, and that it's happening in the history department as well as other departments such as the French department. We have a PhD, Sophie Capmartin. Is Sophie here? Oh, Sophie's not here. She was going to try to be here. She is doing her research on a delegation of Native Americans that went to the French court in 1725 and examining that relationship. She is going to be here this morning to be able to speak to Academy members about that and kind of give an entirely different perspective, not French people in Louisiana and encountering Native people, but in fact Native people traveling to France. But that is a different story for another time. Liz's work focuses on what we call the Petite Nations, the small Native American polities that inhabited this region here, and I spoke about before 8 different linguistic groups, so distinctly culturally groups in language and other manners. Her work analyzes the way that nations shape European colonization efforts and influence the lives of all the inhabitants of Lower Mississippi Valley, and I'd like to welcome her today to talk about this further.
So thank you so much for being here this morning, and thank you for, move the mic. All right, mic is moved. Yeah, so thank you so much to Tulane University, to the Center for the Study of the Gulf South, for having me back. As Dr. Kelly said, I am a Tulane grad, so it's always lovely to be back here. And in particular, it's an honor to be here alongside tribal historians and cultural knowledge keepers from so many of this region's Native nations. And so I want to say also thank you in my language, Mishi Newe Nika, for having me this morning. So my talk today is entitled French Dreams and Indigenous Designs, How Native People Shaped the Development of Early Louisiana. And I want to tell you sort of a slightly different narrative from our standard arc of the story of colonization and of the formation of French Louisiana. In 1699, a group of hungry, bearded men straggled ashore not far from Biloxi, Mississippi. A group of Biloxi Indians observed these salt-encrusted and strange-looking foreigners from a safe distance while they assessed the newcomers. When they ascertained that the men seemed not to be seeking conflict and were bearing valuable weapons and cloth, they emerged and greeted these newcomers. The Biloxi introduced themselves as the people to whom this land belonged, and welcomed the men who called themselves French and Canadians. After engaging the explorers in a calumet ceremony, the essential peacemaking ritual that enabled diplomacy among foreign nations, the Biloxi invited the French to join them in an alliance. Seeing that their new allies were landless and short on provisions, the Biloxis fed and sheltered the hungry French travelers and permitted the French to build a small fort on their lands. As the French expedition established themselves, the Biloxi guides provided the men with directions and diplomatic instructions, introductions to neighboring foreign nations, and thereby connected the French into the region's political networks. In effect, then, the earliest developments in the place the French came to call Louisiana, from the place of the settlement to the set of alliances and networks to the very direction in which the French explorers traveled, were all shaped by the initiatives, designs, networks, and intelligence of a small indigenous polity. So this is just an image of a calumet there at the top. Often when we think of French Louisiana, we think of something like this. Now this is from 1713, not 1699, but this is sort of the image we have in our minds. A broad swath of French-controlled territory, and indeed the French did attempt to claim this much land in the New World. However, on the ground, these territorial claims and the limits of French power looked quite different. The arrival of several dozen French explorers obviously did not convert the Biloxi's land into French dominion, except in the imaginations of European statesmen. At its height, 60 years later, the colonial population of the lower Mississippi Valley was comprised of 4,000 Europeans, 5,000 enslaved Africans, 200 enslaved people who were listed as mulatto, 100 native slaves, and 100 free people of color. So just for comparison, even after decades and decades of disease and dispossession, there were still about at least 32,000 native people in the same region. The French settlers who arrived in this densely indigenous borderland at the end of the 17th century brought with them the goals of establishing a prosperous plantation economy and of politically dominating the lower Mississippi Valley. Louisiana officials looked to the roaring successes of the Spanish Empire in Mexico and Peru and of the English in Virginia, and thus desired their own wildly lucrative North American enterprise. Yet by the 1730s, it was evident that this dream would never be permitted to come to fruition. By examining the first half of the French colonial era, so this period until 1730, it becomes clear that while imperial policy and transatlantic logistical challenges certainly hindered the development of the French colony, the initiatives and actions of enslaved Africans and powerful native people were largely responsible for stymieing the growth of French Louisiana. So although many historians have considered French Louisiana to be a story of a failure of French administration in a peripheral colony, it's actually perhaps better understood as a tale of negotiated outcomes in a contested indigenous borderland. The tenuousness of Louisiana's Atlantic connections and the powerful bonds of interdependency that linked Native and European peoples in the lower Mississippi Valley fundamentally shaped the colonial reality that emerged within this native Southeast. So, despite their grand hopes and imperial ambitions, the Louisiana explorers and colonists who washed ashore in Biloxi, Mobile, in the Pascagoula territory, and on other native peoples' lands quickly found themselves in dire straits. In 1702, merely 3 years after the first French expedition into Biloxi territory, England declared war on Spain and France. This is known as Queen Anne's War in North America. And so while the French were embroiled in this massive conflict, the French crown had very few resources to devote to this colony, and thus Louisiana, a fledgling backwater with minimal value, right? Nobody found gold here. There was no sort of immediate lucrative enterprise. It was largely neglected during the first decade of colonization. The few colonists at Mobile and Biloxi languished while they awaited the arrival of ships carrying critical provisions like grain, livestock, shoes, and gifts for native allies. Without regular supply lines to France, the colonists in Louisiana faced shortages of nearly everything, For 3 years, for example, between 1708 and 1711, not a single supply ship arrived to Louisiana to aid the few hundred settlers, and this led to the periods of abject hunger and dependency and tremendous death tolls for early colonists. Therefore, instead of dominating the region and expanding the control of the French state, these early settlers had to rely on their alliances with the region's native peoples to provide themselves with not only food and protection, but also to facilitate all of their grand diplomatic endeavors. French explorers' first relationships in the lower Mississippi Valley were with the Petite Nations. So this is just sort of a writ large. Again, I've taken the name of Louisiana off of this map, and you can see the larger interior confederacies of Choctaws and Chickasaws, and we're going to zoom into this lower Mississippi region between Natchez and New Orleans and Mobile. At the turn of the century, this region was home to more than 35 small native polities, each of which ranged in size from about 200 to 2,000 people. And collectively, these people totaled, by my estimates, at least 17,000, just the small nations, not inclusive of Choctaws and Chickasaws and Creek peoples. So collectively, the French called these smaller polities the Petite Nations in order to distinguish themselves from the larger inland nations like the Chickasaws and the Choctaws. The Petite Nations each controlled discrete pieces of territory along the Gulf Coast and the Mississippi. They spoke, I have more than 5 languages, although Dr. Kelly just told us it's more than 8, so I'll correct my number there, and were of a variety of ethnic and cultural backgrounds. By forming relationships with these diverse small polities, the settlers who claimed Louisiana began to make inroads along the Gulf Coast. As historian Dan Usner has demonstrated, groups like the Mobilians, Tahomes, Tunicas, Pascagoulas, Biloxis, and other Petite Nations provided critical support and alliances during these early years. Native women planted, harvested, ground, and baked corn that fed early colonists. Native men caught fish, led hunting expeditions, built homes, and guided French emissaries along Indian roads through the interior. And again, just to go back, those are all roads and pathways, lest we think this is a wilderness. It would not be an overstatement to describe the state of the French colony as heavily dependent on the Petite Nations. So we can see the centrality of these alliances and of these social and economic ties in just the geography of early settlements. As you can see right here, all of the early French settlements were parts of pre-existing multinational and multi-ethnic settlement clusters. So especially during times of crisis and strain, Petite Nations peoples often settled in clusters like this to take advantage of trade opportunities and protections afforded by greater numbers. These fluid settlements let each group maintain their political autonomy while remaining deeply interconnected. So in effect then, what we think of as Mobile, New Orleans, Fort St. Pierre, Natchez, Biloxi, and later Natchez were not standalone settlements, but rather a single part of these multi-ethnic indigenous cluster settlements. So why would the French be willing to live alongside these native nations? And why would the Petite Nations invite them in? The partnerships among Petite Nations and the French worked in large part because both Louisiana settlers and local native populations were in dire straits at the turn of the 18th century. When the French landed in Louisiana in 1699, they entered a world that had been thrown into chaos by the expansion of the southeastern Indian slave trade. So during the 17th and early 18th century, there was a robust trade in Indian captives in the American Southeast. Native nations had long traditions of taking people they had captured in war and trading them to their allies as ways to solidify political alliances. In the 17th century, British settlers on the eastern seaboard capitalized on this captive trade in order to obtain badly needed laborers for the British settlements in Virginia and Carolina, and actually ship them across the Atlantic and into the Caribbean as well. So you can see if we have Louisiana imagined across the interior, here we have British imaginings of South Carolina going all the way to the Mississippi and Georgia taking up the entire southeast. Because British merchants paid handsomely in guns, munitions, metal, and cloth for these slaves, and because these partnerships with British people offered interior native groups protection from their other Indian enemies, many southeastern native groups did participate in trade in Indian captives. By the turn of the 18th century, this trade had exploded across the southeast, and during the first 2 decades of the 18th century, Upper Creek peoples and other warriors and Chickasaws hammered the lower Mississippi Valley, taking at least 3,000 native people from this region to Carolina. So this isn't considering the death tolls locally, but the amount of people who made it out of the region. Thus, when the French arrived bearing promises of trade and weapons in the 1700s, nations like the Biloxi's saw great potential for these alliances to help them better defend their people from native slave raiders. So again, they're thinking about native politics to structure their decisions of what to do with these French newcomers. However, and again, these are just the paths that people would have used to take native folks back to South Carolina from the deep interior. However, when Biloxi's, Mobilians, Chitimacha's, and other nations saw hope in the arrival of the French, the Chickasaws and Upper Creeks perceived a tremendous threat. These nations recognized that if their enemies, the Choctaws, could form an alliance with the French, this might provide the Choctaw with steady access to guns, which they would then turn on the Upper Creeks and Chickasaws. Therefore, during the first decade of the 18th century, Chickasaw and Upper Creek raiders not only attacked small nations and the Choctaws, but they also started assaulting the French near Mobile. So in 1704, for example, several Alabamas, this is one of the groups who were part of the Upper Creeks, killed a French trader while trespassing into their territory. And in 1708, the Chickasaws threatened to attack the tiny French settlement at Mobile and eat up a village of white men. To combat threats from these powerful Indian polities, French officials sought to cultivate an extensive Indian alliance network that would shield Louisiana settlers from these raids. This defensive strategy required the support of both large and small native nations. For example, in 1704, the French requested help from the Petite Nations of Tahomes and Mobilians, as well as from the Choctaws, to mount a punitive expedition against the Alabamas for the murder of a French trader. Staunch resistance from newly armed Choctaws also helped repulse Chickasaw incursions into the region. While the French crown claimed dominance of the Mississippi River Valley, on the ground, Louisiana officials were acutely aware of the limits of the imperial establishment. As Governor Jean-Baptiste Le Moyne de Bienville recognized in 1711, without the support of the Choctaws, who he described as the key to this country, the French could not expect to hold Louisiana. So we know that Louisiana struggled to find its footing in the early years, and that Queen Anne's War ended in 1713, and by 1718, following a massive conflict led by Yamasee people and involving a lot of South Carolina's Indian allies, the southeastern Indian slave trade also tapered off. Equally as critically, by 1712, the Upper Creeks, so again, the Abicas, Alabamas, and Tallapoosa's, had decided that conflict with the Louisiana colony was just too costly, and there might be an advantage to holding alliances with Louisiana. So they negotiated a peace with the French colonial administration. So why then wasn't Louisiana finally able to become this wildly lucrative colony the French had envisioned? Well, for a while in the 1720s, Louisiana did seem to be on track to be a commercial and an imperial success. Here we go, here's Mobile. In 1718, Scottish financier John Law took over the colonization project and revived interest and investment in Louisiana. The first steps of Law's joint stock company, the Company of the Indies, was to strive to increase the population of what was still an incredibly tiny colony. In 1717, so nearly 20 years after French arrival, there were 400 French inhabitants in Lower Louisiana. And so he began a media campaign extolling the potential of the natural resources available within the Gulf Coast. These propaganda pieces did generate some interest, and so between 1717 and 1721, more than 5,000 French, German, Alsatian, and Swiss immigrants boarded ships for transport for Louisiana. However, this tiny increase was wholly insufficient for Law's vision, and so to supplement this dismal voluntary turnout, the company also forcibly sent more than 1,200 French subjects to Louisiana between 1717 and 1720. So the other critical part of Law's vision was to exploit enslaved African labor to develop the colony. Between 1717 and 1723, the company facilitated the shipment of 3,983 enslaved Africans to Louisiana. The Africans who arrived along the Gulf Coast in the 17-teens and 1720s sustained and revitalized the destitute French settlements in the lower Mississippi Valley. Enslaved Africans constructed the colonial settlements at Mobile and New Orleans, and enslaved Africans also brought with them expertise at cultivating rice, which is an ideal crop for the swampy Mississippi River. So this wave of French immigration swelled the colonial population, and thousands of enslaved Africans promised to transform the region from what Dan Usner has described as a frontier exchange economy, right, largely based on transactions with Indian nations beyond the borders of colonial settlement, into a prosperous slave labor-fueled plantation society. However, resistance from the Natchez Indians completely turned the tide of colonial development once again, and led to what Ira Berlin has described as the de-evolution of a slave society in Louisiana. So in 1714, the Natchez Indians welcomed a few French settlers and soldiers onto their fertile lands as part of a diplomatic partnership. Like so many of the other Gulf Coast polities, the Natchez welcomed a cluster of French immigrants alongside Tiyu, Grigra, and other refugee populations they had already taken in, who were also seeking land in alliance. However, unlike these other populations, the French, first of all, did not eventually move on, as they were theoretically supposed to, and instead they began to demand more and more land from the Natchez. So in addition to being frustrated by the colonists' cows and horses and French inhabitants' ever-expanding requests for land, the Natchez were deeply disturbed by the gross exploitation of enslaved Africans on their plantations. Between 1726 and 1729, the population of French settlers and enslaved Africans within Natchez territory nearly quadrupled, so this wave of immigration has a really strong impact in Natchez in particular. In 1726, there were 105 French settlers and 74 African slaves living besides the Natchez population of at least 1,750. By 1729, there were 400 French settlers and 280 African slaves within the Natchez settlements. So to cap off growing tension over land, enslaved labor, and the destruction of Natchez property by errant livestock, in spring of 1729, the French commander at Natchez demanded an entire Natchez village relocate so that he could use the land to develop a plantation. This final transgression led the village of White Apple, so one of these groups of Natchez within the cluster of Natchez settlements, to seek violent retribution. The White Apple villagers were shocked by this obtuse request to relocate an entire village, and this move seemed to buttress rumors that the French planned to dispossess and enslave Natchez people alongside Africans. During the summer of 1729, the Natchez leaders met to discuss their options. Given the settlers' lust for Natchez land and the concurrent expansion of African slavery, these leaders concluded that it was impossible for Natchez and French societies to coexist in Natchez territory. As one Natchez leader explained, "Before the French came amongst us, we were men, content with what we had, and that was sufficient. We walked with boldness every road because we were our own masters. But now we go groping, afraid of meeting thorns. We walk like slaves, which we shall soon be, since the French already treat us as such. When they are sufficiently strong, they will no longer dissemble. Shall we suffer the French to multiply till we are no longer in a condition to oppose their efforts?" Thus, in November of 1729, they launched a surprise mass attack against the French soldiers and inhabitants in the territory that they hoped would completely wipe out these invasive newcomers. On November 28th, Natchez warriors from White Apple attacked French settlements and killed at least 229 colonists. They captured 50 French women and children and 300 African slaves. The sudden attack on French settlers by the Natchez allies induced a state of panic throughout the colony, as you can imagine, and it appeared that Louisiana as a whole was on the verge of destruction from a pan-Indian war. Fortunately for the French, the Choctaws decided to support the Louisiana colonists against the Natchez. Their assistance at this critical moment truly proved that they were, in fact, the key to this country, as their armies crushed Natchez forces and ensured the survival of French Louisiana. Although the Natchez War failed to eradicate French presence in the lower Mississippi Valley, it did halt the growth of a plantation-based society in the region. Coupled with a successful uprising led by enslaved Africans aboard a slave ship bound for Louisiana in that same year in 1729, it began to look as though Louisiana was simply too high of a risk for either the French crown or private investors to take a gamble on. While the Natchez polity was all but dismantled by 1731, although many of their people continue to survive and live and are still within Creek Nations in Oklahoma today and other groups. Their resistance forcefully reminded French settlers of the dangers of living in a colony surrounded by powerful and far more numerous native people. French transgressions would not be tolerated by their Indian allies. Furthermore, in the wake of these revolts, after 1731, only one more slave ship arrived in Louisiana during the entire remainder of the era of French colonization, and that one did not arrive until 1743. So the combination of enslaved African revolts at sea, Natchez assaults on land, and the difficult logistics of acquiring sufficient laborers and settlers to populate the colony prevented the Crown and the Company of the Indies from realizing their goals of creating a plantation society in the lower Mississippi Valley. In the wake of the Natchez War, French settlers in Louisiana were forced to confront both the precariousness of their hold on Louisiana and their continued dependency on their native allies. And I mean here both their turning to Choctaws in times of political crisis and their continued dependency upon Petite Nations and other kind of people for labor, for assistance, for diplomatic connections, all of this stuff. So while the French did not entirely give up on Louisiana, it remained an important colonial possession to act as a buffer against British and Spanish expansion. And New Orleans, as you know, took on sort of a cultural life of its own. These resistance movements effectively ensured that Louisiana was destined to remain a colonial backwater within a native-dominated borderland. Without a steady influx of slaves, immigrants, or capital, Louisiana grew slowly, and by the end of French tenure in 1763, the colonial population of the lower Mississippi Valley, and this includes both European subjects and enslaved Africans, was less than 10,000 and still represented less than a quarter of the total population of the lower Mississippi Valley. So if Louisiana never became France's Peru, it's not singularly or perhaps even primarily due to colonial administrative failures. During the 1710s and 1720s, the Company of the Indies injected tremendous resources into this imperial outpost at the edge of the Atlantic world. Yet the colony failed to live up to imperial aspirations. While the logistics of transporting enslaved Africans, settlers, and provisions to the Gulf Coast challenged the French crown and the proprietary company, the development of French colonial Louisiana was shaped not only by its tenuous connections to the Atlantic world, but by the power that native people held over the continental ones. Natchez violence, Choctaw coercion, and Upper Creek policies formatively shaped and limited the French colony's diplomatic endeavors, and Petite Nations people wrought its economic and social networks and structured these initiatives. The restraints imposed by powerful native nations and strained Atlantic supply networks fostered a society that was defined by the limitations of imperial power, dependence on its native allies, and characterized by fluid labor relationships. So when we consider the goals of native nations and enslaved Africans alongside those of French settlers, the story of Louisiana becomes not one of failure, but rather a narrative of negotiated outcomes and the contested convergence of Black, white, and red networks in the muddy Mississippi Delta. Anyway, thank you.